If you have been following along, I am building my 1994 Trans Am for autocross and road racing performance. As seen in my last video, I competed in my first autocross event in the CAM class. In mostly stock form, it was easily outgunned by some very well-built cars. To be competitive in CAM class, I will have to get my car handling much better than factory and sort out the typical F-body problems. I aim to do this without breaking the bank. Improving factory suspension involves correcting the typical issues that plague these cars. The issues include excessive chassis and suspension component flex, factory installed understeer, slop and bind in 30-year-old rubber bushings, and uneven weight balance. Being a car that is limited to having a solid rear axle, much of the improvements need to occur in the rear suspension. Another factor that impeded my car's performance was the rear ride height adjustment that a previous owner made. The old owner must have wanted to raise the rear end of the car to look like an old school drag car and installed what looked to be a homemade weight jack or spring riser. This raised the rear end of the car 2.5 inches from stock. With the center of gravity being that high in the rear along with an already light rear end, this definitely increased the body roll and my likelihood of spinning out when driven hard as I did on my last run. I was unaware this modification was made until after my first event, and I would have definitely removed it prior. Tearing into the rear end of the car, the first thing we replaced was the rear differential. The 273 rear gear ratio was definitely holding us back with regards to acceleration and staying in the power band when in second gear. We replaced it with a 1998-02 rear end out of a 6-speed card that came with stock with 342 gears. The new rear gear ratio will increase acceleration and keep the RPM within the power band in second gear. Also, the new style rear ends are supposed to have a better design posi that will perform and hold up better than the 1993 to 97 models. I picked up one for 60,000 miles for $150 on Marketplace. I painted it and replaced the gear oil and posi additive. I was also able to sell my old rear end for $125. Overall, I spent $60 on the swap. Regardless of what class you are competing in, upgrading the shocks to your car will have the most impact on the car's handling performance. There are many options and brands to choose from along with converting to a true coilover system. But the best bang for your buck with regards to adjustability and handling performance are the Coney Yellow shocks. Historically, they have been proven on many platforms to greatly improve handling. The shock has adjustment knob on the top of the shock body for easy adjustment to dial in the firmness and easily adjust between runs. I bought these new for $352. These are one of the few parts I purchased new, particularly because they are hard to find on the secondhand market and will have much more peace of mind with new versus used shocks. The next part to complement the new shocks are the lowering springs. Not only do they lower the center of gravity of the car, but the increased spring rate will help keep the tires in contact with the pavement and reduce body roll. I found a set of lightly used BMR springs for $60 for all 4 corners from a guy converting his car to a drag racing setup. New, these springs go for $300 or more. The rear spring rate is a dual rate system, which is softer on mild cruising and stiffened when driven hard. The ride height drops the rear 1.25 inches from stock height, but considering we got rid of the spring risers from the old rear end, the rear end ended up dropping over 3.5 inches from where it was at the Autocross. This will be a huge handling improvement. There are many great companies that make suspension components for these cars, such as BMR, UMI, and the much respected Stranos. But the BMR were ones I was able to find for a good deal and have a similar spring rate for the Stranos ones that have been used on SCCA national champion winning F-bodies and are well respected in the forearms. BMR does make a set with more aggressive spring rates, but it is hard to say if that would give the best handling performance without making the car too rough to drive on the street. Replacing my shocks and springs with the rear will greatly improve the handling of this car, but to get the most out of these mods will require more strengthening and adjustments to the suspension geometry. The rear suspension design of the 4th Gen F body is actually quite good, and is often considered to be by many to be one of the best handling solid axle rear suspensions that GM created. It utilizes a torque arm that connects the front diff housing to the rear of the transmission, which allows the rear end to articulate without binding. It also presents axle wrap, allowing the power to be directly applied to the tires. The torque arm is accompanied by 2 control arms on each side of the axle to stabilize the up and down movement of the axle, and a Panhard bar which controls the left or right movement to keep the axle centered under the car. The rear suspension utilizes a coil spring on each side of the axle separated from the shocks, unlike the front suspension which uses a coilover style application. The drawback to the setup is the strength of the components and the bushing material and age. The components were all made of stamped steel, which are thin and can easily flex or break under the high stresses of racing. The flexing also acts like an extra spring in the system, which changes the suspension geometry and adds flex where you don't want it. The bushings are all rubber, which has a greater amount of flex in them and gets worse as they age. It is also at a greater risk of deflection than other bushing materials. Without swapping out the suspension entirely for an IRS setup, the next best thing to improve the performance is to replace the flimsy components with more robust parts with better bushings and adjustability. The Panhard bar on the stock suspension does a good job of keeping the axle centered at stock ride height, but when it is lowered, the axle gets pushed a little more towards the driver's side. This increases the chances of wheel contact on the driver quarter panel and inner fender on the passenger side, especially with wider tires. Also, being made of stamped steel, it has an even greater chance of flexing and moving the axle where we don't want it to go. We need to switch to a strong adjustable one to make sure it is perfectly centered at the new ride height. I found a lightly used one on Marketplace for $100. It is from Madman Racing and is made of strong but light chromoly tubing that uses adjustable rod ends to eliminate deflection and dial in bar length. The rod ends are superior in their rigidity and lack of deflection to the stock rubber bushings, and even better than upgraded poly bushings that come on some other aftermarket Panhard bars. This will ensure that axle will stay centered under hard cornering and allow me to run a very wide tire without fear of rubbing. The new Panhard bar goes for $225 or more new. Now that we've corrected the geometry and strengthened the lateral suspension, we must do the same for the control arms. When lowering the rear of the car, we change the angle of the control arm. This can increase the risk of wheel hop on hard acceleration and reduce the power transfer to the tires. The best way to correct this is by lowering the point where the control arm connects to the axle. I found a pair of control arm relocation brackets from BMR on Marketplace. They can correct the control arm angle and have multiple positions to utilize to dial in the geometry for various applications. They bolt right into the stock mounting points for an easy install. Next, we need to replace the flimsy stamped steel control arms with something stronger and with better bushing material. I found a pair of non-adjustable control arms made by BMR on Marketplace as well. They are made of chromoly tubing and utilize greasable poly bushings to eliminate slop and reduce deflection compared to the stock rubber bushings. Although rod end style bushings would do an even better job of reducing reflection, the poly bushings will do a better job of minimizing NVH when driving down the road and will make it a usable street car. The rod ends in the Panhard bar will have less impact on the NVH because it is dealing with the lateral motion of the car, whereas the control arms will deal more with all the vertical motion of the axle and are more likely to transfer vibrations into the cabin. I opted not to go with adjustable control arms for simplicity, and since I was able to get the relocation brackets to correct the geometry. I was able to get both the control arms and relocation brackets for $145 second hand, but unused. New, they go for $410. Lastly, we need to reduce the body roll of the rear end and keep it planted to correct the understeer these cars have. The new springs and shocks will help some, but the part that will do the most to fix that is the rear sway bar. Stock, these cars come with a pretty small and flimsy sway bar with weak end links. Depending on what submodel you came with, the size could vary from 15 millimeters on the V6 cars, 19 millimeters on most Trans Am Z28s and SSs, and in some cases 21 millimeters that came on some years of the 1LE and WS6 cars. Though the stock handling bars would be a great upgrade for a basic Z, V6 or V8 car, there are better options out there. Most of the aftermarket vary from 22 to 25 millimeter bars, but most are not adjustable. I decided to go with BMR's brand new rear sway bar. It is a 29 millimeter bar that is larger, stiffer, and has adjustability built into the bar and the end links. It comes with greasable poly bushings. Being such a new product, I was unsure about trying it since many others had great results with smaller diameter bars on the forums. But having the adjustability built in will allow me to soften or stiffen the bar as needed, which is a great asset to have when making many different suspension components work together. Purchased new from BMR, I bought it for $280. Since sway bars are a personal choice and need may shift depending on how parts interact with one another, I will be keeping all my sway bars in hand in case I need to play with the setup in the future. These cars are very popular platforms and have a lot of aftermarket support, similar to their Mustang foes. Many people are building and modifying these cars, which lead to many parts being plentiful in the second-hand market in good condition. If you have the patience, you can find many good parts and build a well-handling car without having to buy all new or spending a fortune. Considering this is a budget build, we will look at how much we invest in our rear suspension upgrades and how much we saved. Overall, we spent $907, saving at least $510 or more over buying all new parts, or even more if compared to a coilover or IRS conversion. Pretty good considering I purchased 60% of the parts secondhand. With the parts installed on the rear end of this car, we drastically changed the handling performance characteristics of this car. We also significantly changed the stance of the car. I am excited to drive it after all the modifications have been done to see how much better it drives, but we'll have to wait until the rest of the mods have been done. Next, we will tackle the front suspension.